What began as an innocent teenager's search for justice turned into a horrifying path of revenge. What was once an emotionally scarred girl seeking healing became a victim turned executioner. This is a chilling tale about the consequences of betrayal, heartbreak, and the destructive power of revenge. Amara Wilson was a 17-year-old high school senior, once filled with ambition, dreams, and a promising future. She had grown up in a middle-class family where love and support were constant. Her parents, although busy with their own careers, did their best to give her a safe and stable environment. Amara had always been a model student, intelligent, quiet, and well-liked among her peers. She excelled in academics, and her dream was to go to college and eventually become a lawyer. But Amara's life took a dramatic turn when she met Malik Carter, a charismatic young man who was a year older than her. Malik was popular and had a magnetic personality, traits that easily drew Amara in. They began dating during her sophomore year of high school, and what started as a youthful, innocent relationship soon became the center of her world. Amara loved Malik deeply and trusted him with everything, her heart, her time, and her future. He was the first person she truly believed would be with her forever. However, what Amara didn't know was that Malik, despite his outward charm, had a darker side. He was a known player among their circle, and as their relationship progressed, Amara remained blissfully unaware of Malik's infidelity. She trusted him completely, convinced that he was as committed to her as she was to him. But the truth was far more painful than she could have imagined. After 2 years of dating, Amara discovered that Malik had been cheating on her with multiple women. The discovery shattered her world. Not only had Malik betrayed her emotionally, but he had also given her a life-altering gift, HIV. Malik, in his careless selfishness, had been unfaithful to Amara while also exposing her to a disease she could never undo. The pain of the betrayal was compounded by the physical ramifications. When Amara sought medical attention after experiencing symptoms, the diagnosis of HIV was devastating. The doctor explained that the virus could have been contracted months earlier and that there was no cure, just a lifetime of treatment and management. Amara's heartache deepened, knowing that the man she loved had not only broken her heart, but had forever altered the course of her life. Her trust in people, especially in men, was shattered. The guilt and shame she felt were overwhelming, compounded by the constant reminders of her diagnosis. Amara's social circles shrank as she withdrew from her friends, struggling with feelings of loneliness and isolation. But what hurt most was the thought that Malik had done this to her without any regard for the consequences. She felt as if her entire future had been stolen from her, and in her sorrow she became consumed by thoughts of revenge. This deep emotional wound, combined with the sense of betrayal, pushed Amara to a breaking point. The anger that bubbled inside her began to take root, evolving into something darker and far more dangerous. The initial grief morphed into a thirst for retribution, an obsessive desire to make every man who had wronged her pay for what she had suffered. In her mind, revenge would be the only way to regain control and restore what she had lost. Amara's heartbreak became the seed for a deadly plan that would ultimately change the lives of dozens of innocent men, as well as her own. What started as the victim of betrayal spiraled into a calculated act of vengeance, fueled by the very pain she had experienced. In her quest for justice, Amara was no longer the innocent girl who had once trusted freely. She was a victim turned executioner, seeking to right the wrongs of her past in a horrific and irreversible way. Amara Wilson was a 17-year-old high school senior when she first entered the world of love, trust, and eventual heartbreak. Raised in a small suburban neighborhood, Amara grew up in a seemingly picture-perfect family. Her parents, both hardworking professionals, provided for her and supported her aspirations. Her life at first glance appeared stable and nurturing, and she was a model student at school, intelligent, compassionate, and driven. Amara's friends admired her for her maturity and grace, and she was well respected among her peers. In her early teenage years, Amara's world was filled with promise. She was passionate about academics and spent most of her time studying, preparing for a bright future. She dreamed of going to college, majoring in law, and eventually becoming a lawyer to fight for justice. But Amara's life took an unexpected turn when she met Malik Carter, a boy who, like her, was full of charm and charisma. Malik was a year older and effortlessly commanded attention with his good looks and magnetic personality. He seemed perfect, everything Amara could ever want. When they began dating, Amara felt like she had found her soulmate. She believed their love would last forever. Malik, on the other hand, was a far more complicated character. Beneath his smooth exterior was a reckless, self-serving nature. He had a reputation among his friends as someone who was always chasing after new thrills and relationships. Although he expressed love for Amara, he was not as faithful as he appeared. He used his charm to manipulate and keep Amara in the dark about his many affairs with other women. As their relationship continued, Amara grew more attached to Malik, unaware of the multiple betrayals happening behind her back. Her trust in him deepened, and she began to let her guard down. But Malik, driven by his own desires and weaknesses, continued to deceive her, not caring about the consequences of his actions. His infidelity remained hidden for months, and with it came something far more dangerous, HIV, which he unknowingly passed on to Amara during one of their encounters. Amara's eventual discovery of Malik's betrayal was a turning point in her life. The emotional toll of learning about his affairs was already painful enough, but the revelation that Malik had infected her with HIV left her feeling shattered. She was forced to face not only the breakdown of her relationship with Malik, but also the reality of living with an incurable disease. This emotional devastation marked the beginning of a significant transformation in Amara. Her heartache and feelings of being betrayed by someone she trusted completely turned into a vengeful, consuming anger. While most teenagers in her position might have struggled with grief, Amara's internalized pain morphed into a cold, calculated desire for revenge. She began to see the men in her life, including Malik, not as individuals but as symbols of a world that had wronged her. The emotions of anger and betrayal grew into a dangerous obsession with making sure every man who came into contact with her paid for the suffering she had endured. Amara's mental state became more and more unstable as she focused solely on one thing: revenge. She spent countless hours plotting how she could get back at the men who she believed were responsible for her pain. To her, the damage done by Malik wasn't just physical, it was emotional and societal. In her mind, every man, whether they were a friend or a stranger, had the potential to hurt someone like she had been hurt. She could no longer view herself as a victim in the traditional sense. She saw herself as an executioner, tasked with serving justice in her own way. Her personality, once kind and compassionate, began to morph into something unrecognizable. Amar had been so profoundly changed by the betrayal that she no longer cared about the consequences of her actions. The hurt, bitterness, and sorrow consumed her, and it was these emotions that pushed her to take extreme measures, infecting men with HIV as an act of revenge for the betrayal she had suffered. With each man she infected, Amara was not just executing a plan of vengeance. She was trying to regain control of a life that had been taken from her. What started as an emotional response to pain and injustice quickly spiraled into a series of dangerous decisions. Amara's transformation from a hopeful, innocent teenager into a calculated, revenge-driven individual was complete, and with it came consequences that no one could have anticipated. In her quest to make the men who wronged her feel the same kind of pain she had, Amara became a figure of both sympathy and terror. She believed she was justified in her actions, blinded by her own anger and hurt. But in the end, Amara's quest for revenge led to her ultimate downfall, proving that unchecked rage, no matter how justified it may seem in the moment, can destroy lives, both of the victims and the one seeking justice. It all began when Amara Wilson, driven by the overwhelming pain of betrayal and a need for revenge, set her sights on her plan to infect men with HIV. After discovering that her boyfriend, Malik Carter, had not only cheated on her repeatedly, but also infected her with the virus, the emotional weight became too much to bear. The realization that the man she had loved and trusted had stolen more than just her heart, it had stolen her future, was the tipping point. Malik's actions had shattered her life, and in her mind, retribution was the only thing that could restore some semblance of balance. The first man Amara targeted was Malik himself. When they reconnected under the guise of working things out, Amara's plan was set in motion. She had a single burning goal: to make him feel the same kind of devastation she had felt. Amara used their past connection, creating moments of intimacy and closeness, all while secretly exposing him to the same fate she had been dealt. She hoped that if he were to experience the same destruction, he'd understand the depth of her pain. But the act of revenge did not end there. As Amara's sense of justice warped into obsession, she expanded her focus beyond Malik. She began to view all men as potential targets, viewing them as vessels of her suffering. She started frequenting local clubs, bars, and even social gatherings where men were easy to find. Using her charm, she began to lure unsuspecting men into situations where she could carry out her plan. Each encounter was calculated, each touch deliberate. Amara was careful. She made sure her intentions were hidden behind a veil of flirtation, warmth, and kindness. She never revealed her true motives, allowing the men to believe they were engaging with a confident, free-spirited teenager. The men, unaware of the dangerous game she was playing, let their guard down. They believed that Amara was just another young woman seeking companionship, unaware that she was using them as pawns in a cruel act of revenge. Through her interactions, Amara was able to infect 50 men over the course of several months. She didn't just limit herself to one-time encounters. She went further. Some men she seduced into relationships, others into one-night stands, all while knowing the devastating consequence she was leaving behind. The HIV virus, which she had contracted from Malik, was now being passed on to them, leaving them to face the same uncertain future she had. Each time she carried out the act, Amara felt a twisted sense of power, as though she was reclaiming control over the pain that had nearly destroyed her. But what she didn't realize was the deeper psychological toll this was taking on her. With every encounter, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. She was no longer the person seeking justice. She was becoming something darker, someone who had been consumed by hatred, vengeance, and a need for validation. But the true horror of her actions didn't stop with the men she infected. As word began to spread about the sudden, alarming rise in HIV cases within their community, a sense of panic took hold. Several men, after discovering that they had contracted the virus, realized they had all been with Amara. However, by the time they pieced the truth together, it was too late to stop the damage she had caused. As the health crisis deepened, an investigation into the unusual spike in cases began. The local authorities started to question the connections between the victims, which led them to Amara. With each passing day, the web of destruction Amara had woven slowly unraveled. Her past relationships, her social interactions, and her activities were scrutinized. It was only a matter of time before Amara's actions came to light. Amara's plan, born from revenge, would ultimately bring her down. She had underestimated the power of her own guilt and the consequences of her actions. She thought she was justified, that she was serving justice for the pain she had endured. But in reality, Amara had become the very thing she despised, the one who caused harm without regard for the lives she was destroying. Her crime wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and social. She not only infected these men with a deadly virus, but she also destroyed their trust in the people around them. Relationships were fractured, lives were ruined, and the ripple effect of her actions spread far beyond what she had ever imagined. What began as a personal vendetta soon escalated into a public health crisis. Amara's calculated revenge had unknowingly set off a chain reaction of devastation, leading to her being caught in a world she couldn't escape, one where she was both victim and perpetrator. The act of revenge that she had so carefully orchestrated had taken on a life of its own, and now there was no way to undo the harm she had caused. As the HIV cases in the community continued to rise at an alarming rate, local health officials began to take notice of an unusual pattern. The numbers weren't just growing, they were spiking in a way that suggested something far more sinister than a general outbreak. The majority of the new diagnoses were concentrated in a particular age group, young men between the ages of 18 and 30. Most shockingly, many of them had been sexually active in the same social circles, attending the same parties, clubs, and social gatherings. The connections were undeniable, and a trail began to form. Detective Sarah Jensen, a seasoned investigator in the local police force, was assigned to lead the case. She immediately noticed the troubling trend. All of the men involved had one thing in common. They had been involved with Amara Wilson. At first, the link seemed unlikely, as she was a high school senior with no history of criminal behavior. Yet after speaking with some of the victims and their families, she learned that Amara had been seen in the company of many of these young men, frequently engaging in intimate relationships. Detective Jensen knew that the timeline had to be examined carefully. She and her team dug into Amara's social media activity, reviewing posts, photos, and messages that could provide a clearer picture. They spoke to friends, teachers, and anyone who had interacted with Amara in the months leading up to the outbreak. It wasn't long before they discovered disturbing clues. Amara had become increasingly distant from her peers, withdrawing into herself after her breakup with Malik Carter. Her social media posts, once full of laughter and optimism, became more cryptic and at times hostile toward men. She had even posted indirect messages that seemed to hint at revenge, though they were veiled enough to be ignored by most at the time. The breakthrough came when one of the victims, a young man named Eric Parker, who had been diagnosed with HIV, came forward with an alarming realization. He, along with several other men, had all been involved with Amara during the same period. While they had initially suspected the outbreak was just a random occurrence, Eric noticed a peculiar detail. The men who had contracted the virus were all involved with her within a few months of one another. He had a nagging feeling that something was wrong, but it wasn't until he spoke with another victim that the connections became clear. Eric and some of the others who had tested positive began to compare notes. They had all been intimate with Amara during the same time frame, and some of them recalled her insistence on certain types of sexual activity, many of which involved limited or no protection. This raised a red flag. Amara's actions appeared intentional, but what they didn't know was how far she had gone to ensure the transmission of the virus. Detective Jensen's team carefully cross-referenced the men's reports with Amara's known whereabouts and social engagements. Surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and text message records from some of the victims revealed that Amara had actively sought out these men in social settings, using her charm and attractiveness to lure them into situations where she could carry out her plan. Amara's behavior had been calculated. Each interaction had been meticulously planned. It was clear that she wasn't just seeking companionship. She was deliberately using these men as instruments in her revenge. But what still puzzled the investigation team was why. Why would a young woman, who seemed to have a bright future ahead of her, take such drastic measures? What motivated her to commit such an unforgivable act? The breakthrough came when a former close friend of Amara's, Emily Dawson, came forward with shocking revelations. Emily explained how Amara had confided in her about her heartbreak after discovering Malik's infidelities and the diagnosis of HIV. Amara had shared the depths of her pain with Emily, expressing feelings of betrayal and devastation. However, what Emily didn't realize was how deeply this anguish had taken root in Amara's psyche. Emily was horrified when she learned about the men who had been infected, realizing that Amara's desire for vengeance had spiraled into something much darker and far more dangerous. Armed with this new information, Detective Jensen pushed forward with her investigation. Interviews with the victims continued, and Amara's social connections were scrutinized further. The final piece fell into place when Amara was observed attending a local clinic for her own health checkup. Detective Jensen and her team were able to collect evidence that tied Amara to the very virus she had passed on to the men, proof that she had intentionally infected them. The investigation had uncovered a chilling truth. Amara Wilson had used her relationships with these men as a form of revenge, causing irreparable harm to not only their lives but to the entire community. But what remained unclear was whether she truly understood the full extent of her actions. Was it a premeditated act of malice, or had she become so consumed by her grief and anger that she lost sight of the consequences? The investigation, while complete, left the entire town in shock. The community had once seen Amara as a bright and promising young woman, and now they were left grappling with the reality that she had become a source of destruction. The case became one of the most public and controversial in the area, as people struggled to understand how a teenager could cause so much harm. Amara, who had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer and fighting for justice, now stood on the other side of the law, facing the weight of her own actions. The investigation had revealed the depths of her pain, but also the cold, calculated way she had chosen to deal with it. It was a tragedy in every sense of the word, one that left a trail of devastation, not just for the victims, but for Amara herself. And with the investigation now closed, it was only a matter of time before the legal proceedings would begin, and the full consequences of Amara's actions would unfold. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial of Amara Wilson began. The once bright teenager, now facing life-altering consequences, sat at the defense table, flanked by her legal team. She appeared small, almost frail in the cold, formal environment of the courtroom. Her youthful face seemed out of place in the serious proceedings, and the weight of the charges against her seemed to hang heavily in the air. Amara had been charged with multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon, HIV transmission, among other charges including intentional harm, recklessness, and endangerment. The charges alone were enough to ensure that her case would be one of the most closely followed in the town's history. A wave of disbelief had swept over the community when they learned that a young woman once admired by her peers had orchestrated the intentional infection of 50 men. The prosecutor, Michael Bennett, took the floor first. His voice was firm as he laid out the details of the case, painting a clear picture of Amara's calculated actions. He described the pattern of behavior that had emerged, her multiple relationships with the victims, and how she had lured them into intimate encounters under false pretenses. The prosecutor made no attempt to soften the reality of the situation, speaking directly to the devastation caused to the victims. He highlighted the emotional, physical, and social repercussions they now faced due to Amara's actions, many of them now grappling with the weight of a lifelong disease and the stigma that came with it. It wasn't an accident, Bennett declared. This was a premeditated, malicious act of revenge against men who trusted her. Amara Wilson intentionally exposed these men to a virus that would change their lives forever. She used their emotions and desires as a weapon, without a second thought for the consequences. The prosecutor's words were sharp and cold, painting Amara as a person who had crossed an unforgivable line. He emphasized the cruelty in her actions, how she had manipulated her victims, how she had seen them not as human beings, but as tools for her revenge. Next, Amara's defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Carol Simmons, stood to make her argument. She was calm, composed, and empathetic in her tone, hoping to sway the jury's perception of Amara as a victim of her own tragic circumstances. Simmons explained that Amara's actions had been born out of intense emotional pain. She spoke about Amara's discovery of her boyfriend, Malik's infidelity, followed by the horrifying diagnosis of HIV, which she had received from him. She highlighted the extreme trauma Amara had undergone, arguing that the betrayal and the resulting emotional and physical devastation had clouded her judgment. Amara Wilson is not the villain the prosecution paints her to be, Simmons said, her voice soft but steady. She is a young woman who was deeply hurt by the person she loved most. She made terrible decisions in the heat of her pain, but we must ask ourselves, can we truly condemn someone who was so broken by their circumstances that they lost their way? Her actions, while devastating, were not premeditated in the way the prosecution suggests. She was seeking a form of justice, misguided as it may have been. While the defense acknowledged that Amara's actions were wrong, they argued that the intensity of her pain and the lack of emotional support had led her down a dark path. They hoped to evoke sympathy from the jury, urging them to see her not as a malicious villain, but as a troubled teenager who had spiraled out of control. The courtroom grew even more somber as the victims began to testify. One by one, the men who had contracted HIV from Amara took the stand. Their voices shook with emotion as they recounted their experiences. Many spoke of the pain of being deceived by someone they trusted, of the physical toll the virus had taken on their bodies, and the emotional strain they carried. Some of the men were now in long-term treatment, and several had faced rejection from their families and friends once the truth had come out. The stigma of HIV, they explained, had affected every aspect of their lives. I loved her, one of the victims, Jared, a 24-year-old university student, said through tear-filled eyes. I thought she was the one. She made me feel special, like I was the only one. I never imagined something like this would happen. Other victims shared similar stories, each one more heartbreaking than the last. They had all felt manipulated, used, and ultimately betrayed by someone they thought they could trust. Their testimonies were gut-wrenching, and the courtroom was heavy with the weight of their pain. The impact of Amara's actions, the lives she had forever altered, was now undeniable. Amara was the last to take the stand. Her voice, once confident, now trembled as she faced the jury. The weight of her actions had taken a toll on her. She seemed smaller, as though the gravity of what she had done had crushed her spirit. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Amara began, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't, I didn't think about what I was doing. I was hurt, and I wanted to hurt the people who hurt me." She paused, her eyes welling with tears as she spoke about Malik, her ex-boyfriend, and how his betrayal had shattered her world. She admitted to feeling worthless, abandoned, and angry. Amara spoke of the confusion she felt in the aftermath of her diagnosis, of how she had lost hope and could not see a way out of her emotional and physical devastation. I thought, I thought that if I made them feel the same pain, maybe I could make them understand. I was so angry, so lost. I didn't know how to cope. I didn't know how to make it stop hurting, she said, her voice breaking. Despite her remorse, Amara was clear in acknowledging that she understood the consequences of her actions. She didn't deny what she had done. She had, in her words, sought revenge. But I didn't think about how many lives I was destroying. I didn't see the bigger picture. The prosecutor, Michael Bennett, closed with a statement that echoed throughout the courtroom. He acknowledged Amara's pain, but he reminded the jury that justice had to be served for the victims. He argued that revenge was never an excuse for such deliberate cruelty. "Pain does not give us the right to destroy others," Bennett stated. Amara Wilson had the choice to walk away, to seek help, to heal. Instead, she chose to hurt others. She chose to make them suffer, and that is something we cannot ignore. In contrast, Carol Simmons made a final plea for leniency, reminding the jury of Amara's age and the intense emotional turmoil she had endured. "This young woman is not a monster," she said. "She is someone who made terrible choices in the depths of her despair. She is someone who needs help, not just punishment." The trial ended after several weeks of emotional testimony, and the jury deliberated for hours. The case was complex, with strong arguments on both sides. Ultimately, they found Amara Wilson guilty of intentional transmission of HIV and reckless endangerment. The court recognized the emotional trauma that led her to commit the crime, but also acknowledged that the lives she had shattered could never be undone. Amara was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but the court also mandated that she undergo psychological counseling and therapy as part of her rehabilitation. The victims, though scarred by the events, were offered support and medical treatment. However, the long-lasting effects of the case were felt throughout the community, leaving everyone questioning how far one person's pain could spiral into destruction. Amara Wilson's story serves as a harrowing reminder of the depths of human emotion and the destructive power of revenge. What started as an attempt to heal from personal betrayal spiraled into a devastating series of actions that left both victims and society reeling. While Amara may have felt justified in her revenge, the path she chose led to irreversible consequences, not just for the men she targeted, but for herself as well. Her story was one of pain, but it also highlighted the dangers of unchecked anger and the consequences of acting without considering the lives and futures of others. In the end, the damage was not only to the men she infected, but also to the innocent part of herself that had been lost along the way.